I hope the music, the images, the words we have experienced so far have laid a foundation that acknowledges the tremendous power touch can have in creating a sense of belonging, in making us feel safe, in alleviating physical and mental pain, and in bringing joy and comfort to our bodies and our souls. For the rest of this service, I will share my own experiences with touch and my wrestling with touch as an element and tool of ministry. But first, I'd like to invite you to try out another form of gentle touch. Here's what I have in mind. Trying out two backs touching. Right? Two backs, back to back. So anyone comfortable doing that, having your back touch against the back of another person, I invite you then to stand up, and if there's anyone else standing nearby, turn your back to them, and then just gently lean into your backsides until they touch. And if standing is not an option, you could maybe just lean your shoulder against somebody, a neighbor. Just be sure to ask whether this kind of touch is okay. So now, anyone who'd like to try this, please rise and stand up and turn your back to your neighbor. All right, if you would disengage, unless you want to keep staying, that is fine too. My sense is there's some interesting comfort there, a little bit strangeness perhaps. Most of you participated, not all of you did. That's also good. I did grow up in a family where touch was very much present and welcomed. I saw and I continue to see my parents being affectionate with each other. I remember snuggling with my mom. And as little kids, the family would often pile up on top of each other. In my 20s, my brother learned shiatsu, or kind of massage, and offered free sessions whenever I would visit him in Berlin. Touch was a part of that, of course. My greatest reluctance to touch was actually as a teenager, because practicing gymnastics 4 to 5 times a week, I'd built up these calluses, in my hands doing the high bars and the parallel bars and the pommel and all that kind of stuff. And I just could not imagine anyone wanting to touch or hold those hands. A reluctance that I got to explain only several years later to at least one potential girlfriend who had wondered what had held me back during those lovely walks we had taken, a few years earlier. And her interpretation at the time had been that I did not care for touch. She could not have been any more wrong. Fast forward to the year 2000. I'd been working intense hours as a consultant to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, wrapping up projects as I was wrapping up my life in Washington, D.C., going back and forth between Minnesota, my new life, joining Kara there. I wasn't settled in either place yet and was feeling a bit raw already when the phone rang in my office. My parents called, and all I could hear was the word cancer. My heart sank, my resilience melted. I didn't know then that prostate cancer was, when detected early, is not a death sentence, and that my father would likely have many more years to live. He was 59 years old then, and will turn 83 this January, still alive and doing well. I am now 57. Yet my heart was not able to see that future. Only the suffering of my uncle before his cancer became fatal a number of years earlier. After we hung up, I stepped across the hallway into the office of my manager. Before I could say a word, the tears started flowing. So I moved to the window, staring outside. My manager had no idea what was going on. We had a cordial relationship, but weren't close. And yet she came and she stood next to me, putting her arm on my shoulder, my back. And it was exactly what I needed at that moment. She has held a very special place in my heart ever since. The power of touch at work. Another moment came 13 years later. I was sitting in a circle of interfaith clergy up at Havenwood Heritage Heights. Bevan Tulk, your grandfather Clay, was there. We each did our usual check-ins about ministry and life. I went last. It happened to be the week before Kara and I decided to go public with our decision to separate. I didn't realize how hard it had been to hold this news inside, except for conversations with a few close out-of-state friends. My colleagues listened as my broken heart showed itself in between the blurry bursts of tears. They didn't rush me, yet once I had settled some, they offered a laying on of hands. I stood or sat in the center, and they each reached out, touching me gently, giving me the visceral, physical sense that I was not alone, offering healing in ways I had never experienced nor expected. Those colleagues have held a very special place in my heart ever since. The power of touch at work. As I mentioned last week, I was present in the hospital room when Omar, the Iraqi dad of our third refugee circle, died. Right up to that point, the family had hoped for a miraculous turn of events. When the reality finally sank in, I was alone in the room with the mom of the family, Suhaila. I sat close to her, offering my presence, but fully aware of the cultural boundaries at play. She is an observant Muslim woman. For 10 years, there was never any touch during our greetings or any other interactions. I wasn't about to breach that boundary as much as my body suggested otherwise. And yet in her grief, she ended up reaching out, holding onto me, the only option for touch in the room, until other friends and family came in. We have not talked about how she experienced these moments, and we may never do. Yet my sense is that touch provided what words could not have in this time of agony and suffering. My stories so far have focused on touch in somewhat extreme situations. Personally, I'm very much drawn to touch as a mode of connection and communicating in everyday life. In the late 1990s, I was deeply involved in the gay soccer scene in Washington, D.C. I served as a board member and as a coach. We traveled around the country and even hosted the Gay Soccer World Cup, welcoming teams from multiple continents. Looking back, I realized that an important aspect that drew me into this community was the overt physicality, the prevalence of touch and hugs, the comfort with displays of affection. I know it can get complicated, but it did offer something valuable, something I miss at times. I also find it in my interactions with my very close friends Leng and Home and their community, made up largely of gay men. Hugs often have a different quality and length than hugs in my other circles. I'm typically able to lean into our mutual embrace without fear or hesitation, and my body relaxes and opens to whatever emotions it carries. I'm not trying to offer generalizations here about gay culture. I know the gay community is diverse and multifaceted, like any other culture. I'm using these examples simply to talk about my own longings, preferences, and levels of comfort outside the ministry context. Within the context of ministry, I've exchanged hugs with many of you. Often it is just a friendly embrace, a hello, more intimate than, say, a handshake or a mere verbal exchange, yet generally governed by what I perceive to be the cultural norms of length and tightness. And then there have been those other hugs that contained the unspoken message, I'm sad, I'm hurting, my heart is broken, I feel alone or unheard, I need something words cannot easily describe or offer, my body needs healing. Those have been extremely meaningful encounters, some of the most powerful moments of my ministry and pastoral care. And they come closest to the line that I am wrestling with. The line and the fear. The fear that I'm talking about is probably the greatest fear I carry in my soul and in my body. It is the fear of having someone experience my physical touch as unwelcome, as repulsive, as abusive, and for the other person to suffer because of that. And for me to know that my intentions do not matter in this situation. It is the impact that matters. In some contexts, perhaps the intentions affect the impact, and reconciliation or forgiveness may be easier in the long run, but that is not for me to decide or control. And the corollary fear is that I will be accused publicly of a violation of boundaries, even though there was no violation. It's a different story, and yet the fears are interwoven in my mind. So how is this affecting my ministry, our ministry? I tend to err on the side of caution. I try to listen to my intuition, yet also know that I can't fully trust it, and that it is safer to keep my distance even when my body says, offer a hug, touch the arm, put the hand on the shoulder, because that's likely to offer more than any words I can conjure. And I'm aware that I discriminate. I discriminate based on identities, including gender, age, and relationship status. offering a hug to a married, hetero male, age 75, feels different than any touch with a single person my age or younger, especially if they identify as a hetero female. I'm not sure how to think about this bias, but I know it's my way of responding to the risk I perceive for myself and the other person. Of course, there are ways to make gentle touch in the ministry setting reasonably safe for all involved. A hug in a public space with others around can help create safer boundaries, as in the receiving line, right, in the parlor after the service. And then there's the basic notion to be explicit and ask verbally to find out whether a hug is welcome or touch is welcome. And yet it matters so greatly how that question is framed. Like if I say, well, you look like you need a hug. Can I give you one? I'm right in your face about it. Well, that doesn't leave much room for you to say no, does it? Sometimes a nonverbal gesture will actually be clearer. Right? We can sort of play this by ear or by sight. Anything that makes it truly possible for the other person to decline without losing face. Perhaps something like, do you do hugs these days? That opens the door, I feel, a little bit more for the other person to say, no, not really, or I could use a hug right now. Or, the question of, if you ever welcome a hug, let me know. Right? Then they can say, well, sure will, and never come back to it. Or they can say, that hug right now would actually be really nice. So let me now summarize a few concerns and wishes I have for our ministry together. I'm sorry if I've missed cues or have been overly cautious with cues suggesting that touch could have been healing. I am deeply sorry if I've crossed boundaries ever. My hope and aspiration is that you feel comfortable enough to let me know if that ever happens or has happened, so that we can work on repairing the damage that it has done to our relationship. I generally welcome gentle touch and feel that so far I've always been in a position to create the boundaries I have needed to feel safe enough and comfortable. I'm happy to talk about touch and boundaries with any of you. I want to hear your stories about your experience with touch or the lack of touch in your life. Perhaps we can start during our soul and heart conversation after this service. I want everyone to feel safe, yet when we are in a vulnerable state, it is hard to feel safe. Touch can make us feel safer and more connected, and also the opposite. Ministry is an art form, not simply a list of rules. That's what makes it beautiful and messy, healing and potentially hurtful. Touch carries an energy on a continuum. So does emotional intimacy. Boundaries are important and ultimately the responsibility of the professional. Of course, the potential and power of touch is in no way limited to the relationship between minister and congregant. The ministry of touch can be alive and well between congregants, offering all the potential benefits we have heard about and posing the risks we have named. I invite you to make it a topic of conversation, though those around you become familiar with your general preferences, even as they remain aware that those may change at any moment. Ministry is an art. The power of touch is a tool in the artist's toolbox. Singing, from you I receive, holding hands or touching elbows is that toolbox in action. May we open it often. May it be so. Amen and Ashe.
Let us go in peace, and let our service continue.